I've been studying the problem of evil and suffering for years, and like you, wondered, why does God allow so much evil in the world if He's good and He's powerful enough to stop it? What I want to share with you is the top 5 books that I would recommend you begin with to begin to answer that question. Now, you might find books that are more basic than this, and you can certainly find some academic books that are more advanced. These are my top 5 books for either believers or unbelievers who want some depth to begin investigating this question. Now, the first one, probably no surprise, is the book of Job, the Old Testament book. Classic book about somebody who suffers profoundly, and there's dialogue in this book back and forth. Why does God allow this to happen? If we want to understand why God allows evil and suffering and pain, we ought to go right to the scriptures and the book that addresses it directly. The other thing that Job does is it helps frame what we can expect. I often tell my students, I say, if you think I'm going to tell you exactly why God allowed this evil or pain to happen in your life, you're probably going to be disappointed. God doesn't perfectly answer this for us, but it brings us to the character of God and help frames what we should expect in a response. So start with the book of Job. Second, from a friend of mine, Clay Jones, who used to work with me at Talbot for years, wrote a book called Why Does God Allow Evil? I love this book. He actually has probably been studying the problem of evil as much or close to as much as anybody alive. And he asks some of the questions like, how can we suffer for Adam's sin? How did Satan fall in the first place? He takes on some of the toughest questions about evil and suffering in the world and gives what you might call a direct biblical response and brings things like heaven into it as well. Now, the third book I would recommend is you can't have a book list without having something by C.S. Lewis on there. So The Problem of Pain. Now, what C.S. Lewis does is he walks through why pain is a problem for not only every worldview, but for Christianity. And he systematically goes kind of step by step how Christianity responds in light of God's character. Now, later in his life, after he experienced some profound pain at the death of his wife, he wrote more of a lament called A Grief Observed. But this book is focused on how do we respond from within Christianity to the pain we see in the world. And anybody began a search in this question has got to read The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis. Fourth is N.T. Wright, who is a New Testament theologian, gives a really interesting approach. This book is called Evil and the Justice of God. He's not responding to why there's evil and suffering in the world philosophically. He's basically saying, what is God doing in the world? What do we see about God's character from the Old Testament and from the New Testament? And he walks through that God has not just left us to evil, but that the evil we experience is a part of God's larger plan of redeeming the world. So what I love about N.T. Wright's book is he doesn't even try to answer all the questions that come up, but he says we can only frame the question of the problem of evil when we look more broadly in Scripture and in the history of what God is doing in and through the world. Finally, a more recent book that I actually endorsed by Sharon Dirks is called Broken Planet. And she takes on what is perhaps the toughest question people have about evil. What about earthquakes? What about forest fires? What about pandemics? What about cancer? What about parasites? She addresses head on the topic of natural evil. Why is our planet broken? So natural evil is really one of the hardest issues to address within the problem of evil, and I think she does a wonderful job. There are a ton more good books on the problem of evil, others that I use in my class. Let me know in the comments below. If you had a top 5, what would your top 5 be? What books would you include for mine? What would you add to the list and why? I'm looking for good books for my class. I also want to know, is this helpful to you? And if so, what other topics would you like me to give the top books that I recommend on, whether it's sexuality or the resurrection or other topics? Hope this was helpful. Comment below and maybe consider sharing with a friend.